biodiversity based off of genetic factors, or whether or not he thinks it should be considered socially constructed. Because in the past, I've heard him say that he thinks that race is socially constructed, and appealing to essentialist views of race, that is, views that race is grounded in our biology or innate, is old-fashioned and unscientific. Now, I agree with that, but I'm not really sure why Ace feels that way. So I'd be interested to hear his views on this. And so that's why I wanted to have this nice formal debate, and we would go back and forth. So I'll just give a quick reason why I think social constructionism better explains human biodiversity, and I'll let Ace give his presentation. One of the reasons is that we'll have changes in the pattern of human biodiversity, changes in the way you'll have people with different skin colors gravitate to different parts of the world, and you'll have changes in IQ scores, and you'll have them over rapid periods of time. Now, if you appeal to just genetics, or you think that genetics is the primary reason why these changes occur, you're going to have a bad time, because genetics works at a slower tempo. But what I just described are rapid changes in human biodiversity. Now, humans are uniquely dependent on culture as an adaptive strategy. And the beauty of this adaptation is that it allows for rapid change. Humans learn new skills and new ways to interact with their environment. And this learning process allows them to cope with environmental pressures at a significantly rapid tempo. And so that argument right there points to the fact that the type of change that we see in IQ scores in different populations happen at a much faster rate, and it happens at a rate faster than what you would expect to see if genetics were responsible. So I think that one of the better explanations for the changes in human biodiversity and changes in IQ scores, for example, is appeal to environmental factors, appeals to social factors, particularly the enterprise of human culture. So that's just one reason why I think it's a problem if you want to appeal to just genetics alone to explain human biodiversity. And so I'm interested to hear Ace's position, and I'm interested to hear his response to that quick argument that I gave. So time.
Okay, so you made an appeal to the quickness of evolution, and you said that that there's no way that that could possibly be encoded in the genes. As we know, evolution is defined as a change in allele frequency over time. And so the common example of rapid evolution is crickets freezing overnight. Say there's some caged crickets and half of them freeze overnight. The allele frequency has changed overnight and has become more cold resistant. So your mere appeal to the rapidity of evolution is not really an argument for social construction at all. I'm still waiting for any positive arguments that I think would better explain the data. I mean, I have some arguments, and I'll walk them through, but I'm just surprised that I haven't heard any reason for why you think that you have some better explanation, or that social constructionism is a better explanation. You've just appealed to the environment twice. Time.
Okay, so I haven't heard any positive argument from you like I requested. Hopefully when you come back, you'll give your reasons, and you'll actually give your official position, because I attributed a position to you that you might not want to hold to, and you might want to clarify. So I'd be interested to hear what your official position is on these topics. In terms of your example to undermine my point about the tempo of having change over time due to genetics and change over time due to environmental factors, or the human response to environmental factors, that is our cultural evolution. I don't think that you're really taking into account the difference between how evolution occurs in crickets versus humans. Simple way to show that it's disanalogous is that crickets have significantly shorter lifespans. And also the trait that you appealed to, I don't believe is nearly as complex as something as interactions in socioeconomic context or IQ scores, intelligence, that kind of thing. So I merely said that if you have a process where learning is the way that you respond to environmental pressures, you're going to have a faster tempo compared to a process that's based off of evolutionary change over time. Now, you agree that when you have change in humans, it's going to be slower than when you have change in crickets. And if you don't agree, could you give an example of some sort of genetic change in humans that would happen in something shorter than like 30 years, which is how fast we would see IQ gaps shrink in different parts of the world between different populations. So if you could show that, and if you can actually lay out what your official position is for everyone in the room, that would be fantastic. So time.
Well, from what I understand, the IQ gap shrinking is actually not true. It's done the opposite, but that's a side argument. Again, you didn't really address anything about the rapid evolution. The fact is that these things can happen quickly. And I mean, 30 years may not be a long time, but we're talking about genetic change that has happened over hundreds of thousands of years. Not 30 years. So yeah, I will actually get into some of my positive arguments because you again failed to supply any, it seems. And there's this chain of an influence that flows in one direction, and it flows from genes to human biodiversity, from human biodiversity to IQ, and then from IQ to socioeconomic status. What Joe is going to have to do to basically show my argument to be wrong is to show that there's some kind of gap in this chain. Otherwise, I have successfully made my case that genes will influence socioeconomic status. So this is what this whole debate is going to be about, basically. And so from one of the papers actually that I was reading about or reading through, there's this really excellent quote where I'm going to get straight to the point and talk about genetics influencing socioeconomic status. I'm going almost from A to Z right here, and I'll retrace back through a lot of these steps. But the paper says, good governance is a highly complex cognitive task. Leaders and administrators need to acquire and interpret information frequently from multiple and even contradictory sources, process it in the light of differing aims and values, and arrive at decisions. These decisions are not only provisional because because of the evaluation of outcomes and changing conditions may call for fine-tuning or even revision. To govern is to engage in a complex problem solving as studied in simulations, basically being a manager of a community. So the thing is that we're going to talk about basically how there's a correlation between genes, intelligence, and then socioeconomic status. And Richard Lynn probably did some of the earliest research on this, where he, in his book, IQ and the Wealth of Nations, he not only showed that IQ strongly predicted the socioeconomic status, and as we know, IQ is partially genetic, it actually showed that the ethnic variation inside of the countries also aligned with some of these previous correlates. And so the thing is that we can then look at very specific cases, and I'm only going to use one specific case right now. There's a lot of general principles that I want to go through, and to be honest, I don't think that Joe can put forth really any general principles. I think the majority of his argument is going to be about specific cases and not these general processes. And so one really good example of two nations that have drastically different socioeconomic status, but have nearly identical environments is the case of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And these two populations live on the exact same island. They own, each owns half of it. And there's a massive gap in the socioeconomic status. And there's a very strong argument that that socioeconomic status is due to the differential in IQ, and that differential in IQ is due to the human biodiversity caused by genes. And that is the argument. So time.
Well, hold on. Those were just claims. You're saying that this is a place where you have your point supported. But your criticism to me was that I was just going to point to specific places that would support my position. Like I can point to changes in adopted mixed race children in Germany. I can point to changes in IQ scores between Italian Americans versus Italians in the north of Italy and in the south of Italy. And I can easily explain those changes in IQ scores by appealing to like clear socioeconomic and changes in environmental influence. I can do that, but let me just catalog my confusions from your last statements. I wasn't sure if you understand my point that I'm saying these changes are happening rapidly. And what can explain how these changes happen rapidly are going to be appeals to the significant influence of culture. For one thing, we learn things. Learning things speeds up the tempo of our ability to respond to environmental pressures. Whereas with genetics, you're going to have to wait on what you described as being hundreds of thousands of years in order to see any significant change. And so I didn't want to say hundreds of thousands of years, but those are your words. So I was asking you to give an example where you can have such a rapid genetic change in a significant trait like intelligence, right? Or in, please, if you could give that, you would undermine my point about the fact that you can't appeal to genetics to explain the changes and the shrinking in IQ score gaps between populations. You can't explain that on genetics because of the rapid tempo. So if you can undermine that point, that would be great. It sounded like you were like giving us a sneak preview of your arguments. So if you could actually give your arguments in the next round, that would be fantastic. Time.
Okay, so just an appeal to genes again, that's pretty common. And I mean, there have been some genes directly related to brain size, and they've been well studied and well tested too. I mean, it's so simple to look
Is he
up,
fucking
right?
brushing his teeth?
Excuse me?
Could people mute their mics?
I'm sorry, I forgot to
So-
mute myself. I'll mute myself.
As I was saying, so yes, there has been rapid evolution in the genetic history of the human species, and I did make only one specific example, which is Haiti versus the Dominican Republic, and that's the only specific example that I'm going to have. I mean, the rest are going to be basically more general principles, and also some of it is dispelling certain myths. So the thing is that when you actually take a look at the experts who are actually studying population genetics and this kind of stuff, there's been surveys where they're asked about the biological reality of human differences and their genetic component. And the thing is that the consensus for population genesis is that yes, there is a significant genetic component to this. Actually, one interesting thing about it is that in some places, like in China, it's almost universally accepted. It's actually only in the West where it seems that we now have this notion that a good portion of human nature is molded by culture, and that's not the case. Actually, you could almost say that this debate that we're having is race a social construct, or is society a racial construct. And what I mean by that is that there is definitely a feedback loop between genes and culture that affect people throughout their history. And there's, like I mentioned, these genetic correlates with brain structure. Actually, there's even been studies that have shown that we can actually even determine a person's IQ from an MRI. And not only that, but we can determine a person's race from an MRI. These are real differences in people that have had historical effect, and I think contribute greatly to the emergence of the culture that these groups of individuals create on their own. And yes, there has definitely been in much recent times a mixing of cultures, but there's also been very long periods of separation. It's actually been shown that there was very minimal gene flow between Asia and Europe until just recently. So these, like I said, these differences go back very far into the past, and they also predict a whole bunch of things about the culture. Like I said, I mentioned Richard Lynn's work, which Joe completely ignored. I mentioned the results of his work that, again, IQ predicted socioeconomic status in countries. There's a few exceptions like Saudi Arabia or North Korea, because, you know, you could understand, you know, oil or a crazy despotic government will affect the socioeconomic status relative to the IQ. But for the most part, like I said, his work not only explained intra but inter country differences, and the different groups, their socioeconomic status was predicted by their raw IQs. Time.
All right, so that was just like a plate of spaghetti, a whole bunch of claims, none of them were supported, and more confusions about the points I was making. So I'll try and clarify again. I guess I'll start in reverse order. I kind of implicitly appealed to Lynn's work by citing the differences or the shrinkings in IQ gaps. But I'll give another example that appeals to work that was surveyed by Lynn, which is the shrinking in IQ scores between populations in West Germany and populations in East Germany during the Cold War and after the Cold War. So during the Cold War, you have West Germany separated by the Berlin Wall from East Germany. Now, these populations are genetically indistinguishable, but during the Cold War, West Germans scored 10 points higher on IQ tests compared to people in East Germany. Now, after the Cold War, the IQ gap shrank and it became equal. In fact, it's becoming a bit better in populations in East Germany. Now, we all know what the real explanation for that is. And it's because, thank you, it's because Soviet regimes are terrible and they want to just destroy all those wonderful democratic Western ideals, one of them being having a good education. And so that explains why people in East Germany probably had lower IQ scores during the Cold War, and their IQ scores rapidly changed after the Cold War, or it changed over time, right? But it changed over a short period of time. Whereas ASTIS would want to say, given the fact that people in West Germany and people in East Germany are genetically indistinguishable, we would predict a average IQ score across the board for the entire populations. But that's clearly not the case. And we also know what the clear influences that affected why one side had lower IQ scores compared to the other. It's the fact that communism is terrible. Everyone hates communism, that kind of thing. So there's an example using Lynn. He mentioned something about brain sizes. I guess what I should mention is that Neanderthal had larger brains than us. So surely ACE isn't saying our brain size relative to our body size, or that is going to explain intelligence, and that's why people with smaller brains are less intelligent than people with bigger brains, because Neanderthal had bigger brains than us. But look, they weren't intelligent enough to survive the ice ages. So that's a problem. I'm just going to need a lot of the things that Aces mentioned clarified because I don't know where to start. Time.
Okay, so it's really interesting that you bring up Soviet influence because your view would be more similar to Soviet Lysenkoism than anything. Lysenkoism was this radical theory that they thought that basically you could affect the genes through the environment. I mean, it was a communist theory. They believed they could create this new socialist man through the, changing the environment. Anyway, that's your theory is, yes, more like that theory that caused all that damage in Eastern Germany. I don't want to, like poison the well or anything. That's not my argument. I'm just saying it's similar. It's very similar to Lysenkoism.
20 minutes.
And the thing is that, thank you. So you cited that it was 10 points, and I'm sure it was, but we're talking about gaps of much more than 10 points. I mean, we're talking about gaps of 30 or even 40 points between certain populations. So yes, I agree that the environment can radically alter someone's gene expression, but there is a genetic limit. A very good example of this is bodybuilders. Bodybuilders very much know that they can pump themselves full of steroids, but you only go so far with it. The environment can only affect your genetics so far. And again, I wasn't talking about brain sizes. I was talking about brain scans, MRIs. So they were looking at the microstructure of the brain. Time.
Yeah, I just wasn't clear what you were speaking about in general in terms of the brain. So I'm pretty sure I heard brain size, but fine, I'll disregard it. I'm not clear. You're saying that they can look at MRIs and identify race. I don't think that there's any controversy over the way that we can correlate certain attributes that humans have with other attributes given certain sample sets. That's what we do in forensic anthropology all the time. I don't think that it indicates any type of like a innateness in race, but to go back to one of my initial points at the start of this debate, I was under the impression that you actually agree with that asserting that there's some sort of essential view of race, one that race is grounded in biology, you disagree with. And I'm still not sure what your position is at all. Not sure whatsoever. I would really like it if you would actually clarify, because that was one of my goals with this debate, was to finally get you to put your money on the table, to tell us everything so we could be clear about it in the future. Another thing is, what you said about Lysenko, you're going to have to clarify how it's more like Lysenko. What you said, genes are affected by the environment, is something that's also a part of appealing to natural selection. So you would also be concerned about someone appealing to natural selection. Is that, by parity of reasoning, that's what you would end up committing yourself to? Oh, what else? You didn't address, well, what you said about my example, appealing to the two different populations in East and West Germany, was to pretty much agree with it, but then say that there are IQ gaps that are much larger. And I wasn't sure about that information. If you can elaborate on that for me and for the rest of the people in the room, that would be fantastic. So we could actually have something to chew on. So you can actually help us make sense of your position, Ace. So I'm having trouble doing that. Finally, please just make it a bit more clear. You haven't explained how you can have such a rapid change due to genetics, especially since earlier you were appealing to the fact that you'll have change over extended period of time, hundreds of thousands of years. So if you can rectify those two statements, that would be time.
Okay, well, I'm glad I mean, the thing is there are some actual correlates with brain size and intelligence that actually has been shown. It's not as strong as, say, like these MRI scans, but I did post the paper about the MRI scan. That one's actually for the race one. There's also an IQ one, like I said. And then you talked about genetic essentialism, and genetic essentialism basically, to be honest, also destroys the species concept, because what is the essential difference between a crow and a sparrow? Time.
Yeah, I agree with that. Usually our classification system, the way we catalog biodiversity, is due to a conceptual framework that scientists use. For example, there are scientists who are called lumpers and scientists who are called splitters. Scientists who are lumpers are more hesitant to identify brand new species whenever they find them in the fossil record. So instead of saying Homo sapiens sapiens, they would just prefer to say this new fossil that we found is still just Homo sapien, but it has a slight variation, which is consistent with the human evolution. But then there are splitters who are like, this is a species, this is a species, that's a species, everything's a species. This is an example of two different positions that emphasize my point that, yeah, when we catalog biodiversity, you're going to have it predicated upon the aims, goals, and desires of the researchers. Another example, thank you. Another example is appeals to, instead of using phylogenetic trees, you would want to use cladistics instead to describe species. So there are different frameworks in order to identify species and even to identify subspecies. So your point about a crow and a sparrow, I would agree with you. I don't see how that undermines my position. I actually see it as undermining your position, because every time you appeal to science in order to back up any type of scientific or genomic race concept, you're appealing to classification systems that are made by scientists with certain research aims. So I think that's actually a problem for you. It's not a problem for me. Time.
Well, no, the reason why I talked about the sparrow was because use these categories. There are genetic markers that match with these categories. Again, the whole genetic essentialism argument is pointed it out to be a straw man. So I guess since you just didn't really add much to the table, in terms of why you think that these kinds of things are better explained by environment and that kind of stuff. I can't go into specific details. Like I was saying, I mean, Richard Lynn is probably, I think, probably the authority on that's why. And anybody who's interested in this topic, I mean, his work is probably next to none. But like I mentioned earlier, there is this chain of logic that I made between genes to human biodiversity, from human biodiversity to IQ, from IQ to socioeconomic status. And Joe has not broken any of these chains yet. There is this. There are obviously other effects on IQ and socioeconomic status, but from our understanding of the genomic data and things like Joe mentioned cladistics and that kind of stuff, we can actually very neatly separate these groups. Some people prefer to use clusters because that's traditionally how it's used. Some people tend to like the gradient model that Joe is talking about. But the whole point is that there are these identifiable sets of individuals that have these specific gene sequences in them. And we have found that some specific gene sequences code for IQ. Joe is just asking for specific genes that code for brain size or that kind of stuff. And those do exist and they do correlate with IQ. I'm not going to mention the specifics because that's a waste of time for this debate, but they're out there and I can share some. And again, it's been shown that IQ is strongly correlated with socioeconomic status. And this has been shown again and again. So I'm still waiting for Joe to break this chain. Are there any gaps in this chain, or does this chain hold? And then that shows that genetics affects socioeconomic status.
All right, so in order to talk about Lin, he certainly mentions Lin and praises Lin. And I gave an example that's predicated upon surveys performed by Lin, an example he hasn't responded to at all. He's also decided to completely ignore my point about the tempo in which we see these changes in IQ scores in different populations. It's more rapid than what you would expect to see in genetics. One of the ways to break the chain is to note that that chain is predicated upon a slower tempo, that is having change in the biology of these different organisms. It sounded like he agreed with me about the whole entire social constructed nature of these classification systems when he said that some scientists prefer to use clusters in order to catalog nature's biodiversity. Some scientists prefer to look at it on a gradient scale. So he's actually agreeing with me on that point. So I'm glad that there's some agreement between us. He started talking about brain size again. I thought he wasn't talking about brain size. I'm confused there. I feel like I did just break the chain by reminding him of my initial argument that he hasn't been able to undermine. He's only vaguely mentioned. And I want to also remind him of my specific argument, which is comparing genetically indistinguishable populations of individuals who had significantly different IQ scores during the Cold War. But after the Cold War, the IQ scores became even, which is a lot more rapid. The IQ scores, the earliest that were found, for example, were from 1967, I believe. And then after 1990, you're already having the IQ scores the same. Whereas in the 60s, the very first part of the Cold War, there was almost a 10-point difference. And this is just in Germany. It's also the case when you look at the entire range of the countries that were subjugated to the communist terror, countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc, versus that pearl of democracy and inquiry and science, the Western countries of Europe. You see this rapid change after the Cold War in IQ scores in the populations that were once underneath communist regime. Now, the only thing he said about this is he's complained about Lysenko. But when I pointed out that his vague description of Lysenko's biology could also be attributed to natural selection, he's dropped that point. I would be interested to hear him try and defend that as well. Again, well, I guess his main position is that there's a chain, connection between genetics and these traits that we have. But I'm actually not disagreeing with that. I'm just pointing out that the better explanation for those genetics and for the pattern of human biodiversity that we see everywhere, and for the gaps in IQ scores and the shrinking of the gaps in IQ scores, is appealing to environmental factors. He hasn't undermined that point. He hasn't told us what his official position is, and I'm waiting for him to respond to the specifics of my case. Time.
Okay. So sure, you brought up Lysenkoism. You said, again, and you said that I would have to drop natural selection if my argument was held, or to have my argument be coherent. The thing is Lysenkoism denied natural selection. They even denied genetics, and they were radical environmentalists, and they believed that you could will plants into being better, not through selective breeding, but through environmental pressures. And that's the whole appeal to Lysenkoism. That yours is more, your view is more like Lysenkoism. As for the German IQ scores, well, what if we took a bunch of Haitians back in time and we put them in West Germany? Would they have German IQ scores? West German IQ scores? Time.
My thesis is that given the fact that they grew up in an area where education was promoted without like a severe political influence like it was in East Germany, you're going to expect to see people have higher IQ scores. So if Haitian people were brought to Germany and went through their education system during the Cold War, I don't see why I would expect to see them have different IQ scores. That's my claim. And I've tried to show that by showing the difference in IQ scores when the Cold War was occurring, and the similarity in IQ scores between Eastern and Western Germany after the Cold War. And I explained that, and I said that the best explanation for that is the change in the socioeconomic context. One time you had people in a nice democratic Republic of Germany, and the other time you have them under horrors of Stalinism, the horrors of communist Soviet regime. After the Berlin Wall fell, you have people in East Germany having better IQ scores. That is, IQ scores that are on par with people in Western Germany. This was rapid. You still haven't addressed that. So I'm just going to assume that you conceded. And in order to talk about the point about Lysenko, when you mentioned Lysenko, the only thing you pointed out that to say that it's similar to what I was saying is that Lysenko believed that genes were influenced by the environment. But that's a concept that's nice and snug in the concept of natural selection. So by parity of reasoning, if you think that's a fault in Lysenko's biology, and you're trying to compare my use of biology to Lysenko's biology, then you would also have to say that's a fault in natural selection. You're not going to do that. That's why I think that that point falls apart. Can you recap to all of us what your official position is, and maybe elaborate on this chain? Thank you. Elaborate on this chain, and why you haven't addressed my point that I actually appeal to influences that explain that chain of influence, whereas you just merely describe this chain of influence. Time.
Well, sure. I have to keep it high level. And Joe, I'd really appreciate if you stopped William Lane Craiging me. You know, oh, you have not responded to this point, thus you have conceded to this point. It's really silly debate tactic. So as I was saying, there are these differences that are visible in the genes. I don't know what is not clear about that. Joe wants to say that the effect of the environment is going to be greater than the genes themselves. And that's why I brought up the Haitian Germans, or the German Haitians, I would say. The thing is that these studies have already been done before. The most famous study was known as the Abecedarian Early Intervention Study, which took African Americans, and it gave them very high intense schooling in their young age, you know, very creative kind of stuff, a low student to teacher ratio, that kind of stuff. And they found that these kinds of modifications to the environment had no effect on the IQ. To be perfectly honest, they did have some positive effect on their life outcome, in the sense that more of them went to college and that kind of stuff, but it didn't have a direct effect on their IQ. And the thing is that why going to college also isn't that much important is because there have been studies that have shown that the environmental effect of college actually has very little influence on your future success. So, and really the IQ is actually not only the best predictor of life outcomes such as education, occupation, mental and physical health, illness, and mortality. It's also something that is stable over time. And basically the thing is that academic performance actually has very little to do with effort and more to do with your innate abilities. Just because you try hard in college doesn't mean you'll get an A. It's really your abilities that will allow you to get an A. And it's the same thing for job performance too. Actually, IQ is the best known predictor for job performance in all studied occupations. As well as that people with higher IQ tend to be more cooperative than IQ. A lot of these studies have been done and are directly linked to just raw IQ scores, and a large part of raw IQ scores are genetic. And I'm trying to keep this high level here because I mean, almost every single one of my claims has a paper behind it and would take hours and hours to go through, and I'll be sharing all of them. But the thing is that I've made this chain here. This is a general principle that we have this kind of flow between the genetics into socioeconomic status, and that still remains in my eyes. Joe basically just assumes that Haitians would be just as have high IQs as Germans, and like I said, I would hope that he responds to the results of the Abecedarian early intervention study. Opposite time.
Yeah, I'll respond to that immediately. You say that there wasn't any change in IQ, but incidentally, these students went on to have positive life outcomes anyways. Then right after that, you say that IQ score is the best predictor of someone having a positive life outcome. So despite having no change in IQ scores, this group that was brought into a different environment, you claim, still had positive life outcome. But then you immediately, right after that, say that nonetheless, IQ is going to be a great predictor for someone to have a positive life outcome. I mean, are you saying that if you have a lower IQ, you're going to have a positive life outcome? Like, I don't understand why you didn't just see that clear contradiction in the points you make. If you're going to say that IQ is the best predictor for having a more positive life outcome, and I'm assuming you're saying it's the higher IQ, the higher the likelihood of a positive life outcome, then you shouldn't point to a paper that you present and then give the caveat that despite the people in the paper not having the higher IQs, they still had positive life outcomes, because that contradicts that main point. The reason why I'm calling all these dropped arguments is because right at the beginning of this debate, I said I was interested in hearing your positions on all of these different topics. I want to know how you deal with the fact that there's a more rapid tempo that's possible if you appeal to environmental factors, and that's not possible if you appeal to genetics. That's why I'm calling all the times that you simply drop those arguments. I'm also appealing to a whole bunch of specific articles as well. Like I said, I even appealed to Richard Lind's work that he's done for the Western Germany versus Eastern Germany. And I didn't just assume that people in that the people that were transplanted from Haiti into West Germany would just have higher IQ scores. I explained why I think they would have higher IQ scores. And that was appealing to the better education system that was given to students in Western Germany during the Cold War and after the Cold War. Something that the students in Eastern Germany weren't able to have access to during the Cold War, but did have access to after the Cold War, which explains why during the Cold War, there was a 10-point difference in IQ scores between the two populations, and why after the Cold War, they had similar IQ scores. Time.
Okay, well, you were avoiding the point. Like I said, environment has very little effect on IQ. And yeah, so sure, if you get a lot of government spent on you when you're really young, you might feel kind of special and be more motivated to do things. And that might have some kind of effect on your socioeconomic status. But like I said, you are basically assuming, I don't want to say you are, but it seems like you're assuming a form of blank slateism, where you believe that everybody is equally able to match, their IQs if they're given the same environment. That's why I brought up the Haitians in West Germany. You affirm that, and you haven't provided any evidence. And that's why I brought up the Abecedarian early intervention study, because that is direct evidence against your claim. Yeah, and that's why I asked why would they have the same IQ scores? You're just assuming it a priori. Time.
Okay, so I feel like I'm repeating myself now. His evidence that he brought up, that study he just named.
5 minutes.
Thank you. I just showed how he actually contradicted himself, appealing to that study and then making further claims about IQ and its predictive power. He hasn't responded to that. I've repeatedly given an argument explaining how IQ is significantly influenced by environment. I keep on appealing to the difference in IQ scores between populations in West Germany versus populations in East Germany. I said that I feel like my explanation better explains how genetics even factors into how we make sense of intelligence. And so I'm not appealing to any type of blank slateism. I'm really just kind of hearing shifts in views, dropped arguments, and a vague position, and someone who's not really paying attention to the specifics and the arguments I'm giving. Last, he's also said I haven't cited evidence. I've repeatedly said that I've been appealing to the same author and his material, Richard Lynn, his survey of IQ scores in populations around Europe and elsewhere in the world. So now he's just making claims that either show he's not paying attention or he's getting desperate because he's not able to actually facilitate any meaningful position on this topic. Time.
10 minutes, Ace.
All right. Well, so you're just saying I'm shifting views, dropping arguments, and not paying attention, but that's not the case at all. I'm actually taking notes while you're talking, so that just seems like a personal attack and not really a constructive argument for why the environment is more explanatory to IQ and socioeconomic status. I'm not saying that it doesn't play a role. I mean, I'm kind of, my view is that it's 80-20. It's 80% genetics, about 20% environment. And this is the topic of the debate. Is IQ and socioeconomic status more influenced by genetics or by the environment? And so again, you just basically double down on saying that the environment is the most important determining factor by assuming that you could have these German Haitians with the same IQ as West Germans. And you ignored my point about the Abecedarian and early intervention study not increasing IQ. It just increased their, they made them feel special because they had a bunch of government money spent on them. You completely ignored that point. So again, like I said, there's specific, you can find, I'm going to go back to some of my older arguments because again, you ignored some of those too, which is that IQ can be derived from brain scans. There's a paper I linked to in the chat. And so you don't have to take any IQ tests, actually. You can just image someone's brain and get a general sense of how smart they are. And again, yes, there is a weak correlation between brain size and intelligence. And again, you haven't provided any evidence. I mean, usually you would be talking about Stephen Jay Gould and his mismeasure man, but that was shown to be completely false. And Stephen Jay Gould was shown to be a charlatan. But I'm not talking about this kind of raw score. There is a weak correlation. It's 0.3, 0.4, so it is pretty weak, but it is there, and these differences are very real, and you just keep ignoring the evidence. So time.
I haven't mentioned Gould at all. I appealed to evidence supplied by Richard Lynn. What was wrong with that evidence that I appealed to? Time.
No, look, I'm just saying that you're making statements similar to Jay Gould. He was making the exact same argument that Morton was mismeasuring these skulls and that he was basically just this evil racist, when really he actually underestimated the difference. And these kinds of differences in intelligence and socioeconomic status have been pretty held still throughout history. There's actually even some research that found that the level of technology in an environment from 5,000 years ago correlates with the level of technology today. And that you could argue that that's some form of almost determinism, and whether or not it's in environmental or genetic, that's what this whole debate is about. And like I said, there have been quite a few studies that show that yes, the environment will change the genetics, but after these genetic influences have been acquired either through some kind of accident or some such, the environment's effect will take quite a while, and so the genetics will be the main contributor. I mean, you can have certain things like nutrition that might increase or decrease intelligence. I mean, you gave the example of World War II, but the thing is when you have two disparate populations that have a historical differential in IQ, and you put them both into West Germany, they're not going to have the same IQs. That's just a fantasy and assumption that you've made and haven't provided any argument for. Time.
Well, I think that you just undermined your whole point right there by saying a historical differential. You're appealing to something that's not an appeal to genetics. You're appealing to a social phenomenon. Another thing to note is that I guess I could just appeal to another example, since you refused to respond to my example about the difference in IQ scores between people in Western Germany and people in Eastern Germany. Another thing is that when you have IQ scores of the children of Black GIs after World War II versus the difference in IQ scores of children of white GIs, you actually don't have a difference. You have 96.5 in the IQ scores of children of Black GIs versus 97 points in children of white GIs. How do you explain that similarity given the significant difference in genes? Time.
All right, so I'm glad that Joe is showing that all he has is examples. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I have these general principles. I've outlined a chain of logic, and all Joe has to show is specific anecdotal examples and not general principles that we can derive predictive models on. He also misunderstood my argument about a historical differential. I didn't mean a historical differential in whatever sense he meant it. I meant that there was a differential that's been static through history. And that, again, this is why I'm saying that when you have these subgroups that have had differential pressures applied to them and have had differential evolution, they will have differential results. And merely sticking them in the same environment is not going to wipe out those differentials. Time.
That's a claim. Can you support it? Time.
And the Abecedarian and early intervention study. Time.
I explained how you actually contradicted yourself with that study. How do you respond to that? Time.
I didn't contradict myself. I was making myself very clear. Actually, I gave a caveat, right? I said I was being honest about the findings here. And what I said is that it had no effect on IQ. And yes, it had a moderate boost in their sense of self-worth and were more motivated through it. But that's not the same thing as a drastic increase in their IQ due to their environment.
5 minutes.
Your point was that increase in IQ correlates with an increase in like a positive life outcome. You just described a positive life outcome without an increase in IQ. How does that not undermine your point? Time.
That doesn't undermine my point at all, because like I said, this specific case with a highly modified environment, and it created some socioeconomic differences. I'm talking about general meta-analysis, not because, I mean, most of this is not just individual studies, but taking the IQs of many different IQ studies, correcting them, and then basically comparing them to socioeconomic status. And it's been found that there is this strong correlation. I gave some and again, I was being honest, I gave some counterexamples like Saudi Arabia for oil and North Korea for its despotic dictatorship. But for the most part, this trend holds. Time.
All right, so I guess I don't have much time, so I'll just recap the debate and my goals. I was hoping to get the specifics of ASIS's case. and I was a bit frustrated with the way that he approached my responses, specifically when I gave actual evidence pointing to sources. I pointed to the same source that he did, and his response was to say that I'm merely pointing to anecdotes. I find that kind of weird, but what are you going to say? The other thing is, ACEDIS still hasn't really responded to the fact that you're not going to have the rapid tempo on a genetic framework when you're appealing to genetics as the bigger influence. He just appeals to other examples and skirts my examples, appealing to the difference in IQ scores between populations in Western Germany versus Eastern Germany. When I tried to give a more obvious example, and that is the similarity in IQ scores between the children of Black GIs versus the children of white GIs, he merely dismissed that as anecdotal. How about just think of that as hypothetical? How would you explain the similarity in IQ scores by appeals to genetics? Maybe you could do that. Well, I hope that okay.
Well, look, I didn't mean to say anecdotal. Like I said, they're specific. They're near anecdotal. Like I said, you've provided no general principles to describe these large variations in IQ and socioeconomic status. You only appeal to specific examples. And since you're so insistent about me talking about the rapid tempo, yes, evolution can occur on multiple time scales. There can be some very rapid evolutions that happen. And, there's been some pretty good examples of that. I gave one example with the crickets. That's obviously a very extreme example. But one really good example, actually, is specifically correlated with liberalism, actually. Those arose in the South UK, Flanders, and West Germany area. And they're actually correlated with things like extroversion and thrill seeking and that kind of stuff. And those arose a mere 600 years ago. So 600 years is a very short time. And obviously they arose in a single individual who had the mutation, and then the mutation spread through the group. So like I said, evolution can occur basically at a point. Actually, Gould talks about this, even like to trash talk Gould a bit, but he has this concept of a equilibrium where you can have these rapid evolutions with periods of and the thing is that Joe never explained why his assumption in Germany would have IQ scores. He just assumed it by fiat. He didn't give any explanation, and then he conflated better outcomes in socioeconomic status and IQ from that study with a general trend in IQ. So yes, I agree that in this specific instance where you have these individuals that were given the attention, they had higher motivation and that kind of stuff, and that did increase their socioeconomic status. But that speaks nothing to the findings of Lynn or anybody else when it comes to the genetic influence of socioeconomic status. So I wish Joe would have had a little bit more, but I guess that's the end of that. So I see the rest of my time.
All right. You had a minute and a half left.
Sure. Actually, I'll just say really quickly, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? One of my original points that I made about the fact that you have these individuals that are in the same environment, identical on an island, but have vastly different socioeconomic statuses, and that is correlated with their IQ. And Joe never really mentioned that point or talked about that point. So okay, that's really done. Really done. No, that's it.
Okay, you had a minute left, and that's the end of this, right?
Well, thanks, Joe. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Do
you guys want to have like questions or something?
Yeah.
Are we doing Q&A?
Actually,
if, people are, or if they want like someone said a battle royale, if they want that instead.
Well, yeah, let's just loosen it up a bit. I'm sure the recording is still running, so let's just have like a little bit of a free for all. So I don't know, Joe. Yeah, bring up some of the loose ends that you want to tighten up?
Yeah, I don't. Were you not clear on the fact that I was appealing to the same author that you appealed to several times to support my main
Yeah,
case about? What does it mean to then just say, oh, well, that's just to dismiss that type of evidence if you're going to appeal
No,
to
I
it
never
as well?
No, I never dismissed that type of evidence.
Well, if you didn't dismiss it,
Like
what
I said,
was your
you
problem
were
with that
William Lane
example?
Craiging me. Look, you were William Lane Craiging me just because I didn't
What was your
respond
problem with that
to
example?
see the example. So you're talking about the example in World War II, the German one?
Well, it's during the Cold War, genetically indistinguishable population. If you're right, they should have the similar IQ. But
Said it's
during the Cold
80-20.
War,
Like I
I'm
said,
sorry?
it's 80-20. Look, IQ is
It's-
80-20. It's 80. That's my.
I don't understand what you're saying when you say 80.
Look, the whole debate was about what is the greater contributor to IQ and socioeconomic status. And
Yeah.
I think, yes, there is a contribution from the environment, of course. But the debate was about what has the greater contribution. And yes,
Yeah.
that's why I brought up the Haitian example, right? Where these people have specific genetics that don't lead to high IQ. And you just assume that if you put them in the same environment that they would do just as well.
So I don't understand how that responds to my point that you have people who should have the same IQ score but don't during the Cold War, but all of a sudden they do have the same IQ score after the Cold War. It's clear that it's the environmental context and the change in environmental context that explains that rapid change in IQ scores, something that you can't account for.
Look, that's like I said, that's that 20. No, I am accounting. It's in that 20%. Look, like I said,
Joe,
the entire debate was about what is the majority influence.
Why is it 80% if, like I said, you have a slower tempo, which genetics work? You can't say that it's the 80% of the genetics that's working there because it works at a slower tempo.
Look, it's like saying, oh, I've got two pea plants and I don't water one for a while, so it's shorter now. And oh, now I started watering it, and oh, it just shot up out of nowhere. Sure, of course, I agree. But the thing is that pea plant is only going to grow to a certain height, no matter what the environment. And this is why I gave the example of bodybuilders and then pump themselves full of steroids. They max out their genetic limit.
Joe, you really gave no supportable thesis for a causative factor of the environment changing genetic expression. Obviously, as Ace just talked about, if you don't water that fucking pea plant, it's not going to grow as fast as the one you are. But
Brains and muscles are different.
It sounds like you guys are agreeing with me.
Apples.
There's a significant influence that the environment has.
20%. It's not majority. This whole debate was about what was the majority.
Yeah, and
Joe,
I demonstrated
the thing is that all things being equal in the environment, there is going to be a robust racial IQ gap between populations.
Yeah, I mean, Lynn talks about this, right? Lynn's own research goes through this, not only intra-country, but inter-country. However.
So if environmental influences don't influence IQ score, then you're just ruling it out altogether. I could say the same thing. Say all things being equal, if we take genetics as constant, it's going to be environmental factors that affect.
But that's the
IQ
point.
disparities.
Genetics aren't constant, Joe.
They aren't.
No,
They change over time, right?
they change over time. Yes.
Okay,
And
so
thanks to
what's the speed
thanks
at
to
which they
hundreds
change?
of thousands of years of
What's the
human
speed
evolution,
at
we've
which
had
they
greatly
change,
divergent
Vade?
populations.
Oh, Joe's got you on the rate of change.
What's the speed at which they change, Vade?
You realize there's different models of
Well, first of all, there's
speciation, right? Or just like
recombination.
genetic drift. You could have the gradualism model or the punctuated equilibrium model. Both of those
Genetic
are very,
drift.
very different.
Genetic drift. It speaks about change
The
over
mutation rate,
microevolutionary
mutation rate.
tempo.
Yes, the mutation rate.
Okay, I just want to say that microevolution is something that Christians would say, and that's a pseudoscience word. But
Are you serious? Do you want to
yes,
hold to that? Really?
going off of what I
Okay,
just
you
said,
don't.
right?
You don't. I mean, you're just
No,
uninformed. That's
I completely disagree with that.
Yeah, he's
I mean,
a little bit uninformed.
So let me finish what I was just saying. So
Oh, boy.
something like in Britain during industrialization, right? You had entire swaths of moths that were just fucking destroyed because they were all white and there was like a thick layer of soot in some areas. And that would be an example of punctuated equilibrium where you have huge genetic drift because of an outside factor that came in.
Yeah,
that's actually a classic example of natural selection, not genetic drift.
Yeah, it's a natural selection.
Classic
Yes,
example.
Yes. And what is
the whole point? Look,
What is genetic drift to you?
Look, Joe, if you actually want me to bring up the specific genes that code for bigger brains, and then I mean, let's go through that.
We were talking about moss. All of a sudden, what are you talking
about? Look, you guys went off on some.
Well, really quick though, Vade. What's the tempo at which you can have such a genetic change that would shrink the IQ scores so rapid? I mean, can you have that tempo?
No. Look, you're misunderstanding the argument. Nobody is saying that change in this population. Yes, that was all environmental. Look, you just like I said at the beginning.
Are you conceding the point now?
Look, like I said, all you did at the beginning of the debate was give specific examples of the environment affecting specific genetic expressions. You gave no general principles, and I gave this chain of logic that these things flow into each other, and there's a lot of data to support that evidence. And I went over some specific pieces of data to support that evidence. But you haven't shown anywhere where that chain breaks down at all.
Do you remember my response to that?
Go ahead. I may.
It was really just a chain of assertions, not an argument.
Yeah, first of all,
Joe,
it was
to respond about the tempo thing.
Look, Joe. Like I said, I was keeping.
You just merely asserted it, but the idea there is the idea that if we only had a half an hour, you should have attacked Stephen Jay Gould, who I never mentioned. So that's on you. No. You merely asserted that, and then I said, if anything, it explains my explanation better accounts for this chain of influence. Of course, you're going to have genes determine your traits. And I think that what better explains how those genes determine traits is pointing to the environmental context. You
Joe,
failed.
What do you think?
So look, Brenda, look, it was chains of assertions on both sides, right? I mean, we only had half an hour each. And so like I said, I decided to keep it really high level. I gave and like I said, there's a lot of nuance to each of these arguments. But the thing is that Joe provided no general principles. He just provided some specific examples. And like I said, these kinds of things flow into each other. Yes, there's mitigating environmental circumstances, but genetics definitely influences socioeconomic status very deeply.
Yeah. Also, Joe, when you talk about this tempo, you have never even gestured towards any actual research showing the rate of mutations over time in any model of natural selection.
Why would I have to? That's his.
Because that's critical. If you're going to make the case that you can have these rapid changes in genetic capability that give rise to, intelligence or whatever.
Whoa, time out. I'm making the opposite. I'm saying that what accounts for this rapid change in IQ score is pointing to environmental influences.
But no one is disagreeing with you on that point, Joe.
Well, okay, that's awesome then. You guys concede the point.
Yeah, we concede the point that there are environmental factors.
Joe wins. Joe wins the argument.
No, we're not
Joe, dude, you won. But also, is there a gene that codes for like wrinkly brains more than smooth brains? Because that would definitely change everything.
Why is everybody here so fucking stupid? Intelligence is highly polygenic. If you look for specific genes, you're just gonna end up doing shit science. You need heritability estimates.
I just want to make.
Oh.
I just wanna
That's what I was talking about, right? The best,
Heritability. We never thought of that.
It's
Look,
because
the
never
you
thought of that.
shit
The best
kids who haven't
understood
read
That's
the
Joe.
science. That's
That's
why you
Joe
make these
question.
stupid fucking conclusions.
Joe, if we recontextualize this for just a moment, are you saying that you believe that the racial IQ gap among human populations is due completely to environment, and that if you change the environmental circumstances of, say, you know, Australian Aborigines, all right, if you remove Australian Aborigines out of the bushland of Australia and you put them into some extraordinarily high socioeconomic status milieu in the United States and care for them and give them high nutrition from a very young age, that they will have a comparable IQ to a native-born European American?
Okay, so I gave 2 responses and emphasized one of them significantly in the debate. One of them is that I compared genetically indistinguishable populations and showed clearly how one of them was affected by their environmental circumstances, such that they scored 10 points lower than
Joe,
the other
if I may
population.
interrupt, please. The problem
No,
with
you can't, because I'm not done
Eastern
talking.
and Western
I'm not done
Germany is
talking.
that
I wasn't done with
that
my.
is
I
not a
wasn't done
defeater for Ace's
talking.
argument,
I
Joe.
wasn't done. If I could.
That is not a
complete my
defeater for
point.
Ace's argument,
If
Joe.
I could complete my point. So the idea there is I'm showing how you pointing to the fact that they're significantly different at best points that there's just biodiversity between all of humans. But when you appeal to environmental context, it's clear that that gaps can arise even if you have significantly similar, that is indistinguishable populations. You can have gaps in IQ scores between members of those populations given their environmental context.
Not only did you ignore my question, but then you repeated fallacious reasoning that doesn't even actually defeat the argument that was given to you. So let's just make it really childish for you to attempt to understand. If the Australian Aborigines genetically are a 486DX with 8 megabytes of RAM, and a European, these Germans, okay, are like Pentium i9s with fucking 16 gigabytes of RAM, right? And then you split all of these Intel i9s with 16 gigabytes of RAM into 2 populations, and on one of them you install some fucking cobbled together operating system that's kind of like Windows 95, and then on the other one you install, you know, the latest fucking Windows 10 or whatever with all the updates. Okay, apparently the one that has the shitty Windows 95 software on it is going to underperform relative to the one that has the newest Windows operating system with all the latest updates. Now, if you take the fucking Australian Aboriginal 486DX pieces of shit and you put them in Germany and you attempt to install the Windows 10 operating system on it, it isn't going to work. Now, if you go ahead and install the Windows 10 operating system on the population that, you know, would be the Eastern German population, if you install Windows 10 on that Core i9 system, well, all of a sudden it runs great, which is what happened when the Soviets were kicked out and they reunified, and you had this equalization between them because their genetics were capable of meeting that median that the Western Germans had never had mitigated by environment, okay? So, Joe, let me ask you again, do you think that taking Australian Aboriginals from the bushland of Australia and putting them in some high socioeconomic status environment and providing them nutrition and education that, let's even say, within 5 fucking generations, do you think that and of course, let's eliminate miscegenation here. Let's have no gene flow from a superior population into their genetics. Okay, do you really fucking believe that these Australian Aboriginals within 5 generations of being in this high socioeconomic status environment with great nutrition and education are going to be competitive versus their European American peers?
I know I
They'd
do.
be smarter. Yeah, they'd be smarter.
I didn't really understand because I'm a Mac person. I'm not familiar with the operating system.
Smooth-brained Mac person.
I am more of like a Linux person.
I'm a Linux person.
Well, his argument,
What's that?
his argument begs the question, since he's assuming that there's a fundamental hardware difference between Aborigines and Europeans.
We can actually
and
show that in
that's
pictures.
begging the question. That's begging
It's
the
not
question.
begging the question. It follows from the evidence.
What regioning do you use?
Here, I even posted this study, right?
The study
Modeling-
doesn't show the
modeling the
correlation to
3D
specific
geometry.
genes.
Look, modeling the 3D geometry of cortical surface with genetic ancestry, right? I posted this very early on in the debate, and it shows that racial differences can be seen at the MRI level.
It doesn't show that one is smarter than the other.
No.
So that's like saying
alone-
that like
Wait,
skin color will matter just as much.
No, but
just
the
fuck
funny
all this
thing is-
shit. Wait, skip all this. Okay, why do we don't even need to find specific genes. We don't need that at all. That's overly
No,
mechanistic.
we don't need to find.
So then we don't care about the hardware.
No, look, we do not need to find specific genes to infer heritability. We've already done heritability inferences without the genes, and so that's called a top-down inference, right? And we're also doing bottom-up inferences where we are inferring directly from the genes. And the thing is that as you would expect, top-down inferences would overestimate the heritability, and bottom-up inferences would underestimate the heritability, and that is the case. But it does seem to be anywhere between 50 to 70% if you take into account both of them.
But the study you showed did not link intelligence to brain differences. It just showed that they exist even amongst similar populations.
Well, there's a separate study, right?
Okay.
Yeah, here it is. I mentioned this in the debate too. Functioning, connectome, fingerprinting, identifying individual patterns of brain connectivity. So
what kind of fucking argument is that? That intelligence, like, do you think
So
it
this
has
is-
something to do with the fucking lungs or something?
All right. Keep
So
going
this
with your
is in
point.
Nature. So this was published in Nature, right? They posted another one, but yeah. So that one, they actually did MRI scans and were able to infer IQ using MRI scans because of the connection, the connectome, the functional
On
connection.
how many people over how long of a time?
This was a pretty recent one, and I think it was a pretty size.
How many people over how long a time over what region dispersion or distribution?
Here,
And, like,
wait,
how did they count?
sorry, that's the paywall. Sorry, that's the paywall.
Okay, I need to know methodology of this thing.
Okay, yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. One second.
Okay, then we'll ignore that piece of evidence for now.
I'm gonna get the study right now.
Wait, aren't you arguing in good faith here?
No.
Yeah, so here we go. Where is it?
How would being able to tell somebody's IQ from their MRI scans demonstrate your position?
Well, that's a part of it, right? So that is the very important link between genetics and IQ, because there's
that's
some
just
genetic
showing- that's just-
expression- wait, I'm almost done. There's some genetic expression that instantiates itself into some kind of phenotype, and this phenotype has morphological differences, and we can suss
You're
out
just
these correlations.
begging the question again, because
No,
also
no.
this is a
Oh,
different
God.
type of IQ test. I mean, without the ability to take an MRI scan, we would just give them an IQ test. But that doesn't show your position at all. That just shows what their IQ is. That's all. That doesn't demonstrate that it's genetic.
For G, right? Like,
Yeah.
So, but we have.
I mean,
we have,
presumably,
I posted a study.
presumably somebody's IQ is realized in their brain. I mean, we're not saying that there's like a ghost in there. What the dispute is over whether or not environmental factors account more than genetic factors, right? And you haven't shown, and simply being able to measure IQ by doing an MRI scan does nothing to show your case at all.
Well, we
Why
have
does the
evidence. So,
gap
for example, we
disappear
have
if you
this
control
problem with
for
African
environment?
Americans where we've spent billions of dollars and we have improved schools across the nation, and that we have given them a middle class to upper middle class
The
lifestyle.
white man's burden,
And
it's so heavy.
no, not white man's burden.
White man's
Be
burden
quiet.
is
All right,
so
I'm gonna have to mute
heavy.
you. You had enough time to fucking spew your stupid bullshit. So I've muted you, and I'm not gonna bother with you for the rest of the period of
That's
this
probably a good idea.
discussion. So, but anyway,
You can't.
after these African Americans had been given a very high socioeconomic quality life from a very early age over an extended period of time, now it's been 2 generations. All these initiatives started in the 1980s. SAT scores for African Americans have flatlined. Meanwhile, they have continued to increase for whites. Now, you would assume that after the expenditure of all of these billions of dollars, and increasing the socioeconomic status of a significant portion of African Americans, especially in the Northeast United States, that you would see an increase in SAT scores. SAT is by the way, a rather strong proxy for IQ, which is then again a proxy for G.
Yeah, it's not like there weren't other environmental factors in there.
And
Well, the
doesn't
discussion here was about environment. So
doesn't the SAT gear you toward like American culture, I guess?
Well,
Like,
hold on a
literally,
moment. I just wanted to get that out of the way because the next thing was the study that I posted, which I don't know if Ace has even seen this one yet. It's relatively new. It just came out in 2007, about a year ago. So the title of this paper is Genome-Wide Association Meta-Analysis of 78,308 Individuals Identifies New Loci and Genes Influencing Human Intelligence. If you read the abstract to that paper, you can go to like Sci-Hub or whatever to try to get the full text if you like. I'm not going to bother, but
what you just
pretty conclusive at this point that we have these gene loci that or loci that can be shown to be causative of high intelligence. And it says even in the abstract that where is it? We show that the identified genes are predominantly expressed in brain tissue, which, obviously, but, so the idea that environment, right, which we've already, assented to the idea that, yeah, environment does in fact have an effect on the expression of intelligence, right? Like if you have, right, you're going to have a difficult fucking time. But if you don't have mercury poisoning and you're an African American, and you don't have mercury poisoning and you're a Caucasian, all things otherwise being equal, the Caucasian is going to outperform that of the African American. And that's robust. All of the evidence shows this. We've spent billions of fucking dollars trying to make it not so, and we can't do it.
Well, but a libertarian would
And
take this argument, right, and say government intervention is just useless, right? And he would think that the reason why there's nothing changed by that, right, is that government intervention is not a good way to solve a problem. He would then say that the free market
how's this
is
relevant? How is this at all relevant?
None of this is at all relevant. This is just
Yeah.
bullshit. This
Okay,
is
so-
I'm
whiny.
stopping the recording here.
I didn't want to go
No, it
through,
is
but look,
relevant because
okay, get
it
to
is relevant because Wade, by making this point, is assuming that the government giving a lot of money to this project is helping anything, right?
Juker,
Well,
it isn't that
there-
complex.
look, there
Hold on,
are
Juker.
some-
We're just talking about the influence of environment on the development of high intelligence.
Yeah,
Okay?
sure.
There's not a lot of factors that you have to account for. You got to have proper nutrition. You have to have access to information. You have to have, a relatively stable family life and these types of things. Okay, it's really not that complex. And bringing in this fucking bullshit about whether the government or the free market is better at doing that.
What
shit
I'm saying,
is fucking
African
crazy.
Americans are nutritional.
The fact is that we took
don't
all of
have
these
access to
ghetto
good nutrition.
populations and brought them out of poverty and
African
gave them all the nutrition
are
they needed
strongly
and all the fucking
He muted you, Brenda.
needed, and all that other
That's
shit.
why he's
That's
talking
his
over you.
problem. That's his problem.
Still,
African
there
Americans
exists
are
this
still
robust
discriminated
He's a
against
man
in the
baby who
United
can't
States.
listen to opposing views and he's triggered.
No,
What
I,
I'm saying,
Yes, you
No,
are.
he's
I
actually,
muted
he's a
him
troll.
Yes, you are.
He's a
because
troll.
he was being extraordinarily rude.
You're a free
but
speech
they-
warrior, and you're triggered, and you're a dumbass.
No, actually, he's just a troll.
I'll
He's just
unmute him,
fine
but I
in-
mean, if he's going to continue to
Okay,
be rude, I'm just
Nice
gonna
one,
mute him again.
status
Well,
quo
so
warrior. Nice one,
it's
status
kind
quo
Well, I'm
warrior.
going to
Look,
insist
it's
on proper
kind of the
pronoun
same.
usage.
No,
What I-
Brenda, I'm going to refer to you as a he
what
as
I
well.
was saying, what
No.
I was saying is
So,
you don't have
as
to necessarily agree with the assumption that throwing money at this problem is a good way to solve it. You don't
Look,
have
that's besides the
I'll
point. Look,
repeat
that's
it.
besides.
We changed their environmental circumstances to be one where there was rampant malnutrition, broken families, and little to no access to stable education. Right? Those are really the three main factors for the development of high intelligence. And so we've done that. We have accomplished that with a significant portion of the African American population, and yet their SAT scores have been flatlined. We've seen no improvement. We've seen no improvement over 30 fucking years. You'd think there would be a marginal improvement. There's been none.
So, okay, I wanted to keep it high level, Joe, but actually there's two very important genes that are
He's
correlated
deaf
with.
Ace.
I know he's deafened. This is for the benefit of the room because I wanted to keep it high level. I didn't want to go into these specific genes. But there's two genes. One's called ASPM. The other one's called MCPH1, which is also known as microcephalin. And these basically arose in the Middle and both of these actually in the Middle East. And the thing is that these genes are very strongly correlated with larger brain sizes and higher IQs. I mean, obviously, IQ is an extremely polygenic trait, but these are two genes that people like Joe would want to say, "Oh, you got to find the genes, you got to find the genes." But I avoided that because I wanted to keep it high level. And there are specific genes like SM and MCPH1, blah blah blah, that have been identified and no doubt contribute to brain size and average intelligence.
But I'm guessing that the influence of these genes is not that high on brain
No,
growth.
it's actually quite big. Actually, if you do knockout studies, or well, no, you can't do knockout studies on these, but there's similar genes that that have been found using knockout studies in other animals, and it basically causes like the entire whatchamacallit, the cerebral cortex to just completely shrivel up.
By the way, the study that I linked to this huge meta-analysis of 78,308 individuals, they found substantial genetic correlation, which F over G is at 0.89, which, I mean, if it's one, that would be a direct causative factor that we could say conclusively this absolutely causes the development of high intelligence. So 0.89 is nothing to snuff at.
Yeah, 0.89 is a very, very strong correlation.
Substantial.
It's definitely, there's like three categories. I forget, like weak, moderate, and substantial. So yeah, it's like probably the strongest